that it is largely denied by US culture. So a lot of people think that we live in a classless society, in that, America is more or less a meritocracy in which if you work hard, then you can go beyond your social class that you were born in. Um, there's a lot of people who, might be what, regardless of your social class, they would say that, we're solidly middle class, right? And so there's a strong identification of the middle class. But what does that actually mean in societal terms? Um, what does that mean in socioeconomic terms? These questions vary. So the reasons for people denying that there is a division of class in our country has a lot to do with the meritocracy system of like getting up by your bootstraps and oh, if someone, my grandfather came from X and X country and I was able to make it. So these are kinds of opinions that pervade within society. Are the fact that we have equal opportunity, right? And so, the United States, we're very diverse and we have a lot of testaments to the fact that it does not matter what kind of creed or, race or gender or sexual identity or nationality you are, that we're supposed to treat you under the eyes of the law. So there is a legal blindness to most of the demographic differences. We'll discuss in a little bit whether or not those are actual differences, regardless of the legal system. Some people, believe that we have a chance for upper mobility. So the fact that someone could, grow up very poor and have a rags to riches story, and end up owning a multi-million dollar empire. This is something that's also prevalent and uniquely American. And also, a lot of people would say that, they look beyond our classless society because it's overshadowed by other concerns. So, for example, race or gender or religion or nationalism. These are things that really define your identity or define the American culture. And so one would argue that social class isn't a part of these. However, yes, social class still exists in the United States, and we still have vast differences among Americans as far as income, as far as property, as far as power, and our life chances are significantly influenced by social class at birth, despite the claims in which one can kind of bypass this upward mobility, um, the classes for upward mobility. So, for example, kinds of educational choices that you make. Were a lot of you, did you go to private school? Or did you attend public school? And how does that affect your chances into getting into college? Access to technology. So, a lot of urban communities, you might have access to technology, but there's parts of the city that experience a lot of blight among its citizens, and people still don't have access to technology. And also talking about the network of opportunities that come with education. Um, in being able to get an internship because you know someone or your uncle, worked there, or being able to finesse your way into a corporate world, and the kinds of language that's embedded within this knowledge. And looking at the statistics, you can also see that there's a great disparity between the rich and the poor, and that the highest earning 20% of families made more than half of the U.S. income. So you would think that the highest 20% would make 20%, but as it stands now, the top 5% still owns a lot of the wealth in America, which leads to a dwindling middle class, and it leads to a growing number of lower class individuals. And so, what determines things like social class? Is it your income? Is it the level of education? Is it where you live? Do you live in a rural versus an urban area? It could be your occupation. It could be a function of, your social mobility. So, for example, if your great grandparents grew up in poverty, how many generations does it take you to get to wealth? And so, all these criteria kind of contribute to the definition of what linguists would and sociologists would say to determine your social class. So it is not only one function, but it's a numerous amount of functions. So, for example, um, how necessary is a standard dialect for your job? If you work a very managerial role, what kinds of language abilities are you afforded, or can you do you have to code switch into certain dialects in order to be taken seriously at work, right? So these are some of the discrepancies that some people have over others. It has a lot to do with other factors that have, nothing to do with material wealth, but things like power. So, what is the degree that a person can control other people with? What are the objects or symbols? Language can be part of this, right? That have value attached to them. And what kind of prestige or respect or favorable regard do you have, or does your language have? What kind of linguistic prestige do you have? So, in all societies, there is a form of hierarchy. The United States is not the only country that has this social stratification or distribution of rewards. It's not equal in, these rewards are not entirely equal in any society. They still exist, even in more equitable countries. You'll still find kind of a hierarchy. How steep that hierarchy, or the basis of the hierarchy, however, varies. So, in some countries, they'll have a sharper class divisions. The United Kingdom has more class divisions than the United States. But that could change depending on what kind of data that you look at. Are you looking at income only? Are you looking at generational wealth or inherited wealth? Some would say that the US has more class divisions than Denmark, right? Where, everyone kind of has kind of the same income or the same quality of living. These kinds of social stratification might vary depend on who you talk to, but also it's manifested in the language as well. And so we'll consider some of the social classes and the differences. And we'll start with look at United States versus United Kingdom, and you'll see that over time, the amount of income inequality, might advance despite the intergenerational earnings. So just to look at, the mobility among classes is relatively common in the United States, right? Children of the rich are able to afford a great deal of advantage. They're able to network. They're able to have a social safety net if they fail. So, for example, if you're born into a wealthy society and flunk out of college, it's fine. You can do other things because, your family has that kind of social network for you. People of different classes also have fairly limited personal contacts, they're geographically segregated. So, for example, my one of my friends used to be a White House intern. And it was very difficult for him because he moved from Hawaii. And so, he not only had to purchase a plane ticket here, but he had to figure out housing. He had to figure out, how to network without his family being close by. So, the geographic segregation definitely contributes to this. Intermarriage among different classes is uncommon. I know that, for example, the prince and Prince, or I think it's the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Prince Harry, and his wife Meghan Markle. This is not only among different social classes, but also different nationalities as well, different ethnic groups. But as far as looking at the statistics on social mobility in the United States, it's very uncommon. So, not to say that you can't, grow up and marry a prince or princess, but that is a very uncommon story. Old money tends to maintain the class position of the next generation, and tend to hold incomes compared to new money. And speaking of new money, the greatest access to higher circles has actually been through technology. So the fact that a lot of people have modest means and then they go out to Silicon Valley and they make a ton of money, and that gives them access to these to a higher social group. So social class affects, your media choices, your interpretation of your media content, your power over your media, how you're able to represent media, and who's represented, right? And one could make an argument that, media and language are very closely intertwined, and the kinds of language you learn is through the media that you consume. And so this is also one aspect of what makes social class and language um, so closely intertwined. So speaking about language and language attitudes, I do want to give a kind of a brief overview about the kinds of social and cultural belief and practices that we have. So, people have different attitudes towards language, and these attitudes really, look at what is accepted in one's um, personal critique, but also society and culture in general. So, when we look at language attitudes, we're looking at how people accommodate to others. How, when people interact, do they adjust their speech? Do they adjust their vocal patterns, their gestures? Do they, how often do they use a particular speech style to index a kind of identity? So, I was said earlier that we'd be focusing on the UK first because there's quite a disparity between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. And so this is a video of a certain social group, right, called chavs, or it might be self-called chavs, but they're also labeled chavs. And so, think about the ways in which they choose to represent themselves, but also how the media represents them. So, this is an interesting look at the kinds of class divides that the UK has, because we have class divides in the United States, but I think in the United States it's closely tied to race and ethnicity. And not to say that race and ethnicity isn't a factor in the UK, but as you can see, this is a kind of it's a little bit different. So the term chav, or the label chav, has a class connotation and is associated with people who live in public housing. The way that they decide to dress themselves, their clothes, how they wear their hearings, how they dye their hair, how they speak, right, is more, it's associates them with their identity and who they are. But it's very interesting how they kind of reflect the kind of working class identity of people in the UK. And so, here's some common words used. I will say that this is not only chap speak. This is used all over England. Um, but yeah, so you have words like barmy for crazy, or dicky for feeling unwell, or something's a little bit dodgy. It's a little shady. Again, using these words doesn't mean that you're a chav. Using these words doesn't index a certain, social class per se. But these are some common words used in some of the, some of the language varieties among social classes in England. Here are some other common expressions. I'm knackered, for I'm tired, taking a mick, teasing, making fun of, want a brew, for want a cup of tea. So, if you watch more videos, you'll understand that England has a vast amount of different dialects, and no one really speaks, unless you're, royalty. No one really speaks the Queen's English, even though they're taught it at school. But this is something that's it's depending on what region you're from. There's lots of regional dialects, lots of regional expressions. And again, social class may or may not have an influence on the way that you speak. Um, and just because, these are some common expressions doesn't mean that all people from a certain class choose to speak these terms. So, a common dialect of people in England, especially in London and East London among the working class, is Cockney rhyming slang. So, Cockney rhyming slang, has there's lots of theories as to where it originated from. Some people say it's originated from an Irish speaker. Um, but this is a very interesting kind of it's a very interesting representation of words because the Cockney rhyming slang is derived from taking the expression from rhyming a word, and then using that expression rather than the word. So to give you an example, if you wanted to talk about someone's feet, then they would take something that rhymes with feet, which is plates of meat, and in Cockney rhyming slang, they would say plates. So instead of saying, I like the shoes on your feet, they would say, oh, I like the shoes on your plates. Um, so very, very, very interesting because, in my point of view, it's kind of like, how would you know what they're rhyming with? Like, a lot of things could rhyme with feet. How do you choose plates of meat? How does that come about? But this is something that is very rich. It adds to the linguistic diversity of the area, and it indexes a lot about someone's personality and also who they choose to identify with. This is a video of Bernie Sanders, and it kind of goes over some of his idiolects as a speaker. So Bernie Sanders, he's a native New Yorker. He's Bernie Sanders, right, instead of Bernie Sanders. And so this kind of New York accent is very typical of the place where he grew up, right? And so the video kind of asks you, like, how is it that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are both from New York, but what makes them different, sound different? And really, the answer is social class. Bernie Sanders grew up in more of a working class environment, and so he kind of grew up with the dialect of the people in that time. And speaking of which, so William LaBeouf, he's an acclaimed linguist from University of Pennsylvania, and he really looked at the New York City English that contributes to some of the ways in which Bernie Sanders talks. So he looked at the final and post vocalic R's. So so these would be things like Bernie Sanders, right, instead of Bernie Sanders, right? And so this is what we call a New York accent, or parts of Boston also have it, right? And so this is what we call non-rhotic accent. So when it's non-rhotic, it means that you use a for an R, and when it's rhotic, it means that you say Bernie Sanders. So this kind of non-rhotic accent, lost its prestige when the Midwestern accent arrived as the standard. And so the Midwestern United States accent is very R-ful. And you can kind of hear in the differences between American speech and British speech just how R-ful we are, right? We're able to use much of our R's, whereas a lot of people in New York and Boston and in England are very R-ful, or sorry, R-less. So LaBeouf, he set out an experiment to try to see whether the R use reflected social class, and he also found out it was widespread in younger speakers as well. So what he did was he went to three different department stores, and he went to Saks, which is considered to be an upper class department store. He went to Macy's, which is a very middle class, and he went to Klein's, which is very working class. and then he interviewed the floor walkers, the sales, and the stock boys, and he wanted to see whether or not they said the word R. But the thing about linguistic experiments is that you can't just go up to someone and say, "Hey, do you say the word R?" Because then you draw attention to it. So what you want to do is you want to kind of ask a question in a certain way that will elicit an R or R-lessness response. And so the way he did this was he would go up to people in the on the sales floor and he would say, "Excuse me, where are the women's shoes?" And then the salesperson would say, "Oh, it's, if they're R-less, it would say, "Oh, it's the fourth floor," right? And then he would say, "Excuse me," and then the salesperson would also respond, "Fourth floor," right? Or the salesperson could respond with, "It's on the fourth floor," right? Being very artful. And so he's able to count how many times that he heard people say fourth floor versus fourth floor. And he was able to obtain this data from 264 people. So he really went up to 264 people and asked them where the women's shoes were. So what he hypothesized were that the salespeople in the highest ranked stores would have the most R, which means that it was a prestige form. Like you want to sound artful. You want to be high class, right? So you'd say the fourth floor, right? The shoes are located in the fourth floor. And then he also hypothesized that those would be those who were geared more towards working class individuals would say, "Oh, it's on the fourth floor." So what he found was exactly that. He found that 38% of Saks store used no R, so that meant that they used the New York and Boston variant 4-4. That meant that they were more artful, right? So they used fourth floor more often, which contrasted with the salespeople in Klein's who had almost 80%. They never used the word. They never used the R. So they were more fourth floor. So, did this range by occupation, right? Does your job, depending on if you're a salesperson or a floor walker, did that depend on whether or not that you could pay more attention to your speech? And he did find that, the more likely that you were to use to interact with people, your job was to interact with people and walk the floor, then you would use more R versus if you're just a stock boy and you're in the back, then you didn't use R that much. And so he also found that the pronunciation of the post-vocalic R depends on how much the attention is how much the speaker is paying attention to what they're saying. So remember, he would say, "Where are the women's shoes?" And they would say, "Fourth floor." And he'd be like, "What?" And he'd be like, "Oh, fourth floor," right? So the second time, he noticed that the second time, a lot of people were more artful. So, for example, if he asked Saks folks individuals, they would say fourth floor, and then he had said, "Excuse me, where?" He'd say, "Oh, it's on the fourth floor," right? So they were paying more close attention to their speech, and they were able to use the more standard forms, which made it made sense as to why they would be more conscious of the fact that maybe you didn't hear, and so they would try to mitigate that with the usage of R. So another interesting thing that Bill Above noticed was that the lower middle class speakers actually use the prestige forms at a greater rate than the upper middle class speakers. And the way he reasoned with this is because, he said it was a form of hypercorrection. That the lower middle class speakers, they want to attain the next higher status. People on the lower class, they don't want to sound like people from the upper class. It's the ones that are just below the threshold of, the middle class or upper class that want to use it, right? Because they want to sound more proper. But hypercorrection only leads, you might be able to use these prestige forms, but you might not understand kind of the workings of the language. So, Bill Above, you can repeat his studies in New York, and it'd be very different because in different speech communities, the standard's different, the prestige is different. So, for example, the R is pronounced in New York, but in places like Reading, England, they don't pronounce the R. Or sorry, they don't pronounce the R. So the R is pronounced less by higher social classes. So, for example, in England, if they wanted to be posh, they would say car, right, instead of car. And so the R in England is considered to be the use of R is a lower social class than New York. So, before and above, the dialect studies have really focused on rural speakers and they ignore these social factors like gender, like class, right? But Bill Above was able to say that no, these social factors are very important and they actually make up language a lot because, it could be, next class we're going to look at language and region. It could be you're determining where your speech is determined from where you live and your background. But in a lot of cases, your speech is determined by your social class and the people that you interact with. And he was able to kind of coin this term linguistic insecurity. And we'll talk about linguistic insecurity in a little bit, but linguistic insecurity really just means that like you really want to pay attention to your speech and you're not secure in how you speak. Um, and so Trudgill, he was an English linguist. He didn't replicate Bilbo's study, but he did his own kind of study in the UK, and he looked at word final ing. So he looked at words like running versus running, or swimming versus swimmin' in Norwich, England. So he looked at the words from two different schools, the 10 children, and then stratified them by social class and sex. He was able to figure out that class predicted the whether or not you use ing forms or in forms more than gender did. So your social class was more important to your speech usage than your gender. So Trujillo also looked at the variation among speech styles, and he saw that, as far as whether or not speakers are reading out loud, whether or not they're using word lists, whether or not they're using formal speech and casual speech, that it runs parallel among all social classes. So you'll see the lines, they don't ever intersect with one another. Because they're paying more attention to their speech, right? Everyone's paying more attention to your speech if they are reading it in a list versus if they are just speaking very casually. So he's able to look at different social classes ranging from lower working class to middle class. I don't know why he didn't do high. Oh, he did upper working class, and he was able to see that it was very different. But again, the lower working class sometimes had or always had more instances of in run in versus ing running. And the linguistic variables are conditioned by both class and gender. So, the lower working class are more likely to use vernacular forms than the upper middle class, regardless of gender. So, last class or a few classes ago, we talked about, the differences between genders and the way that people use them. But actually, social class in this instance has a higher effect. So the lower the social class was, the more frequent the regional pronunciation. But women tended to be more standard because they subscribed to what Bill Above said was linguistically insecure. Whereas in careful speech terms, the lower middle class men preferred the regional terms. And Trudgill said this was more of a masculine connotation in that when uh, the males, they purposefully choose regional terms. They purposefully choose to use the slang in their area because it kind of indexed their masculinity. They sound, more manly if they use cuss words or if they use some of the terms. But in careful speech, I found that the upper middle class men, they preferred standard forms. So, linguistic insecurity, like I said earlier, is this anxiety, this lack of confidence, when you are not aware of the rules of a language. So, a lot of you might be feeling linguistically insecure about some of these, common usage forms. Like, do you know when to use who and whom? If someone knocks on the door, do you say it is I or do you say it is me? Or, is the term you can get the book to him and I or him and me? And to be honest, like, some of these things I have to look up because this is something to where, it's very arbitrary, like we said in the first lecture. But I think everyone kind of experiences some form of linguistic insecurity, even if they're native in the language. So these two studies really looked at the prestige, so what kind of value that these languages have, and what kind of social factors that contribute to their understanding of the language. So if something has overt prestige, it means it assimilates to the standard, versus if it has covert prestige, it differs from the standard to create the difference. So, for example, in some communities, especially Baltimore, it's more of a prestige to say Baltimore than Baltimore, because if you say Baltimore, it shows that you're an outsider, that you aren't really from this area, right? So these, even though it's not standard, it's create a difference between we're the insiders versus you're an outsider. So, every you have Chudgill study, you have Bill Above study, but Eckert and McConnell Gennett came out and they said, okay, you know what? It's not only social class; it's more about other social values. So, for example, what are the ways in which people are talking? What are the ways in which they share their beliefs? There's more than social class and just like the things that I mentioned before, like money and education. It's effectively how do they create what they refer to as a community of practice. So these communities of practice or speech communities are groups of people of any social class. It could be students, workers, friends, families. I'm sure that, some of you might have people who come from richer families than you do, and you have some people who come from poorer families than you do, but you still have a particular community of practice. And it doesn't, in a way of speaking, that doesn't really matter, I guess, what is your financial background. And so they created a study, and I think it was a book, but it focused on these two groups in Detroit, and they were called the Jocks and the Burnouts. And actually, this is if you're a fan of the movie Mean Girls, they actually kind of showcase some of this. If you look at the map that Regina George's character gives Katie's character, Lindsay Lohan's character, you'll see that there is a cafeteria table for jocks and a cafeteria table for burnouts. But they really looked at these two sets of people in a high school, and they said, okay, the jocks, they were middle class, they were established, they participated in activities. Their social life was revolved around school, and they were college bound. They wanted to leave school and go off to better pastures. Whereas the burnouts, they were mostly from working class backgrounds. Their friends were local. They wanted to stay in the area forever. They didn't have a means to leave the area. They weren't going to college. And so they were trying to figure out, what are some of the things that index the identities between these two groups. They found that the burnouts were more of a working class culture. They, were very urban oriented. They wore these cut off jeans, and they smoked all the time and wore black. They shopped at Hot Topic. I don't know if that was around in the late 80s. But, they were consciously the have nots. They kind of surrounded themselves with this feeling or this identity that they rejected institutions, right? Um, but this is not to say that they despise each other. They were a very close knit community. They shared goods and services and shared in problems, and were more concerned about things outside of school. Contrasted with the jocks, the middle class culture in which they, looked at urban areas. They mostly focused on institutional engagement. So these were your athletes, these were your cheerleaders, these were people who were college bound. They were, very cautious about making these social relations because these social relations can turn into things like scholarships, right? If you maintain a collegial relationship with your teacher, and you're able to kind of bypass some of the I guess like hardships of school by sticking around to your social group. And so Eckhart looked at things like negative concord. And so negative concord is like, for example, I ain't going to no store. And for I am not going to the store, right? So you negative concord is like you every time you have a negative usage, you always use a negative usage. So like I ain't gonna do no homework. And Eckert. She looked at the burnout girls and the burnout boys more emphatically used cases of negative concord than the jock girls did or the jock boys. And so the jocks and the burnouts emerged as a response to this shared orientation, which is the school institution. Had nothing to do with their social class, but it was related to a social class, but the class did not determine what they were. So, for example, they could be um, wealthy. I think the wealthiest were the jocks, but they could have been wealthy in other ways, or had lots of money, but they just did not, really align with the school institution. So that's what really, confirmed their status as the burnout. So these communities of practice are defined not by the membership, but by their engagement of joint practices. And then, the interesting thing, the takeaway was that they could develop these radically different responses in opposition to the worlds in which they live. So they're actively, they both live in the same area, participate in the shared school, but they had these radically diametrically opposed reactions to them. So, and looking at the linguistic market, so we discuss all of the kind of features of class, and one of them was power. But language is a medium of power. So the ways in which you speak, whether or not you're conscious of it, is an indication of how you align. It could be how you align, by the institution or part with the social structure. So each time you communicate, you're actively participating in the social structure of your world. Um, so the types of languages that you use or dialects that you use is very much a symbolic capital of the resources available to you. And that's, of course, based on your social status and the prestige forms, the prestige manners of speaking. So, for your discussion questions this week, examine, is social class still important in the 21st century, right? Especially with technology, right? If technology is the kind of big, it allows you to jump from one social class to another, is it still important? Do we still have these divisions? How do people of different social classes speak differently? How does class relate to language? What are some features of lower class English or higher class English? Like, what does it mean to speak in this bourgeois sense or this posh sense? How do these relate to regional and ethnic features? Can you describe a moment in which you've been linguistically insecure? And then also, what are some linguistic features that function as a social marker in your society? I'm very interested to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you on the discussion board.